So now that we have the basis for following up on plot and story structure, and you've got a lot of resources and things to look at in addition to what we've discussed, we're going to start looking at individual genres in greater detail. And we have multiple options that we can pursue. And at this point, you can feel free to skip to any of the genres that we've discussed. However, I suggest that you stick with the program so that we can progressively build details about these different genres together. Now, why have I chosen the crime genre to look at first? Well, next to the Western and science fiction that we've been looking at in just a general way to help us build an understanding of genre as a concept and of plot, we have something that is pretty visually obvious thanks to clothing and settings. So there's an emphasis on street gang clothing, inner city locations, like in Training Day, for example. There's a lot of things that tell us that we're in the world of the gangster story, even if it doesn't belong to the gangster genre. There are all kinds of things that have a very fitting tone early on in that movie. And Training Day is, at its core, really a cop as criminal drama with a lot of elements of the buddy cop story type. And it's really kind of hard to peg it, what genre that it belongs to. But it belongs to crime as such, and it has the look of crime in many ways. But for our purposes, I want to look really very specifically at different parts of the crime genre and ways that are more visually obvious than Training Day. And so we're going to think about historical representations, for example. And so let's start with that. The historical characteristics of the gangster plot makes this region of the crime genre a great place to start. Because gangster films, they almost always deal with history in and of itself. If they're not deliberately examining a historical period, they tend to be encapsulating how things look and feel during the era in which the story takes place. So Boys in the Hood, for example, it impressed many, many characteristics of dress and speech and music into the popular imagination, and we can revisit it now as a historical document, but at that time it was really just telling a lot about the era the filmmakers were making it in and how they perceived that era. And the gangster activities themselves tie into particular geographical regions that the story was talking about, and we just see a great representation, almost like a time capsule. So there's that historical element. But another reason to look at crime genre first is to help us learn more about story structure. So when we're thinking about genre, we're never going to leave story structure behind. We want to return again and again to this Oedipus narrative theme, and it's very, very helpful when we're looking at story structure in gangster movies. So as you'll recall from when we were talking about Oedipus, Oedipus kills his father and he sleeps with his mother. These are two very distinct crimes for which Thebes was punished until Oedipus punished himself. And in so doing, Oedipus became a kind of scapegoat for his city. And in many ways, Oedipus treated himself as a criminal by playing the role of detective, and so many scholars have suggested, with apologies to Edgar Allan Poe, that Oedipus is the earliest example of the detective plot. However, if we're going to start thinking of Oedipus as a criminal and a proto-figure for the gangster genre, it's really important to realize the following. After Oedipus killed his father and arrived in Thebes, he seized an opportunity for advancement. So Oedipus has a certain opportunism, if you want to read it this way, that provides an example of character behavior that strongly parallels the lines of action that we see in many gangster movies. And this is the rising up from low origins up to a very high place and then falling back down again. And indeed, a significant number of gangster films feature protagonists that overstep the status given to them at birth. So here are some examples that you should watch because they're very, very illuminating. Little Caesar, Angels with Dirty Faces. There are two versions of Scarface to look at. And you have each of the Godfather movies where a hero rises above an original situation and they begin to be diminished. So as the stories progress, the hero rises to prominence, and of course, as with Oedipus, there's this dramatic arc that requires a fall from grace, usually with some form of punishment. And this is precisely the narrative arc that we find in our major example, which is Goodfellas. Now, Henry Hill, the protagonist, comes from a poor background, but he quickly rises through the ranks of the mafia, and he reaches these soaring heights of wealth and power before his own personal power begins to lead him to his downfall. And there are plenty more examples, but just by watching a handful of gangster movies, you're going to instantly spot this pattern. And your ability to spot this will create great pleasure in your movie watching life, and you'll wonder how you got along without it, because it's just so amazing to be able to watch a movie and just be like, uh-huh, there, I see it. And it won't diminish from it at all. It won't make anything boring. It'll make it much more exciting. So let's look at some more definitions for understanding genre itself, using the crime genre as our basis. I want to develop our understanding of the crime genre and the gangster movie by looking at terms that we can apply across the board. So there's an interesting tool that we can use that comes to us from a philosopher you may have heard of named Ludwig Wittgenstein. And he talked about defining the definition of definition itself. So he talked about characteristic definitions, functional definitions, and prototypical definitions. Characteristic definitions, Wittgenstein tells us, this is defining something by naming its characteristics, which is why it's called a characteristic definition. So for example, a table is a flat horizontal surface that is typically empty, and then things can be placed on it. A table is of such a height that it can be used by human beings, and it is placed in a room. So this is a characteristic definition of a table. Now in English, we can also use the word table for geographic formations, such as mesas. But here things get circular because mesa is also the Spanish word for table. I mean, we don't want to get into language games here, but it's just interesting to think about that. The word for graphs that represent financial and statistical data also use the word table. So there's something horizontal that can be used to place, store, or represent things on a real or imagined surface. This ultimately comes to use the word table. And so if we want to apply a characteristic definition along these lines, noting that table can then wind up leading to mesa, which then can, go through different languages and so on and be kind of messy, characteristic definitions may not be that useful at the end of the day. But if we do apply it to gangster movie, it would be very simple to say, well, if a gangster movie has a gangster in it, it must be a gangster movie. However, Wittgenstein would point out that sometimes we encounter things that we cannot define characteristically. For instance, if every movie that has a gangster in it could be called a gangster movie, then there would be a lot of gangster movies indeed. So we've mentioned David Lynch before, and several of his movies have gangsters in them. 2 of Cronenberg's films that we've talked about have gangsters in them, but we don't necessarily think of either as gangster films or even belonging to the crime genre. As we've seen, A History of Violence has been compared for various reasons to a Western, and there's a struggle here. So I think it's fair to say that if Wittgenstein were a film scholar, he might skip using the characteristic definition strategy, and he would use functional definitions instead. So let's look at functional definitions. A really easy way to understand the concept of functional definition is to think about weeds. Well, what is a weed? A weed is a plant that we cannot define in terms of its characteristics. For example, there's no definable physiology that makes a weed a weed. Rather, a weed is a plant that we don't want. A weed can have flowers and be just as pretty as any other plant, but if it's not what you want on your lawn, then the plant is a weed. So functional definitions work by allowing us to be pretty flexible and make changes to the subject of analysis as we go along. So if you wanted to make dandelion tea, for example, then a plant that is sometimes called a weed now belongs to either something that's quite pleasurable or it's medicinal. And so this definition is functional because it's got some wiggle room for context. Now, extended to the concept of genre, consider this. If you were studying the gangster genre and you really wanted to write a chapter about David Lynch movies, then you could change your definition of the gangster genre just enough for one or more of his films to fit the bill. With even more flexibility and some agile argumentation, you could structure a thesis that potentially demonstrates that all of David Lynch's films belong to the gangster genre by virtue of their connection to the film noir. And if you read a lot of genre criticism or books about different story types, you'll find that film studies authors resort to functional definitions all the time. Anytime we make tiny or large alterations in our definitions, we're making those definitions to suit certain purposes. So when we're writing about movies or any topic, it's important to be aware of when you're stretching established definitions to suit your purposes. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with doing so long as you're conscious of it and you're making it part of your discussion. That elevates the dialogue when you're aware of the terms and you're discussing how you're deliberately bending them, and then others can use your discussion on that level. Now, we want to look at Wittgenstein's prototypical definition, because a prototypical definition is quite interesting. It's a definition that exists when we have a definition that we can all agree represents the thing that we're talking about. We might not know all of its characteristics, and there may be too many functional definitions floating around that muddy the waters, because in some sense functional definitions are so bendable that they create a lot of murkiness and less clarity than we would wish. But we can tend to know what something is when we see it. So in many cases, a prototypical definition is a definition that just reflects common sense thinking, doesn't require a whole lot of debate. So to give a very simple example, if you were to tell me that The Wizard of Oz is a musical, well, it would be pretty silly for me to say, no, it isn't. The Wizard of Oz is many things, and it can be described in many different ways. But that said, it would be ludicrous of me to say that The Wizard of Oz is a gangster movie because it has three men in costumes who helped Dorothy destroy a common enemy, namely the Wicked Witch. That would take the power out of the functional definition, and it would take it too far. But at the end of the day, The Wizard of Oz is most certainly structured around a large number of songs sung by characters in a way that advances the narrative. And most songs even include dance steps that contribute to plot and character. So on this basis, it only makes sense to call The Wizard of Oz a musical. And anyone who would deny this has even more work ahead of them than the person wishing to claim that the movie belongs to the crime genre. So you really have great power in this prototypical definition, just trying to think about what makes sense to most people across the board. Now, as we continue, we want to see if we can create a prototypical definition of the gangster movie by finding things that we can all agree on. And one way to do this is to use the tools we already have, which is outer form and inner form, and this will help us accomplish this definition. And it's something that you can repeat in your movie watching life moving forward again and again. So, to begin with, in order for there to be gangsters in a movie, we need to see a group or a network of people, but not just any group of network or people. This network or gang has to be engaged in activities that some socially sanctioned group considers illegal. In gangster movies, that group must be directly related to the law. And in terms of outer form, clothing will often tell us who belongs to the police and who belongs to an organized crime syndicate. Not always, though, because sometimes the police will dress like the criminals and sometimes the criminals will dress like the police. Then we have inner form tensions that will show us the struggle at the level of plot, and we get things like facial expressions that the actors have that will reveal elements in which a character finds him or herself in a situation of spying or subterfuge or some process of transformation from being illegal to upstanding legal citizen or vice versa. And when it comes to inner form, it's really important to realize that the law is not just a force that threatens the gangsters who break it. In a gangster movie, you will often see and hear the attitude that it's the law itself that makes the crime. So for example, movie gangsters often run their businesses just like other kinds of businesses. They have rules, procedures, and cash flow problems based on supply and demand, and in many cases, it's not so much that they're breaking rules, but rather that the law has chosen to see what the gangsters do as a criminal form of business. And you'll note examples of this tension in Goodfellas, which is highly recommended viewing to go along with this part of the course. The next important aspect of most gangster films involves linking behavior with specific settings. So gangster movies tend to take place on the streets, in back alleys, in cars, in casinos, in restaurants, at family gatherings, sometimes even in backyards during barbecues. And each of these settings connects with certain behaviors. When you watch Goodfellas, you'll see a story about Italian gangsters. But if you were to look at a movie about an Irish gang, or a Mexican gang, or a black gang, you will tend to see that the behaviors of these gang members are linked to their settings. So there's cultural questions at play here as well. Setting, cultural background, and behaviors. And these behaviors of the gangsters help us build up this prototypical definition. So the actions of gangsters tend to swing between extremes. You have extremes of fondness and hostility, for example. The person who is your best friend or your brother one minute can become your deadliest enemy the next. And such extremes seem so particular to this realm of the movie world in the gangster genre. So this is a broad overview. Let's look next at the notion of crime and punishment as part of our definition of the crime genre.